This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week, my guest is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist John Branch. My guest this week is a reporter for the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the best sports writers, feature writers around, and the author of an upcoming anthology of his work. John Branch, welcome to The Other 51.
Oh, am I glad to be here. Thanks, Brian.
Now, I've been asking people how pandemic life is, but we're kind of almost on the other side of pandemic life. So how is, I guess, coming out of pandemic life for you right now?
It's wonderful. I've actually been traveling the last couple of weeks. I just came from an event this past weekend, yesterday. And so I'm back in the throes of, middle seats and crowds at the airports and all that. And in a weird way, I'm enjoying it. It's kind of nice to sort of feel normal. And, people like me who like to go out and do stories on the road and in person, this is a much better thing than the past year.
So what's traveling like right now? Like this past weekend, what is it like being in an airport and on an airplane and all that?
Yeah, it feels really normal, except for everybody's wearing masks. So it feels normal. The planes I've been on have been, for the most part, full. But there's, I think, a lot of respect. You get a little nervous when they start passing out pretzels and everybody starts lowering their masks and nibbling on pretzels. You also feel like a chipmunk because you're trying to wear your mask and then stick your fingers up underneath your mask and nibble on these pretzels. It's just a weird time. I'm trying to envision a time I'll be on a plane where people aren't wearing masks. Like, you realize how close you are to everybody.
Right.
And I joked yesterday that one nice thing about the masks, I mean, certainly other than saving lives, maybe a second nice quality about the masks is that you can fall asleep on airplanes and nobody realizes that your mouth has just dropped totally open.
So the hidden benefits that we've come out of pandemic life, that is one of them, definitely. Right. And you kind of mentioned this a minute ago, but what has it been like? You're a reporter who gets out there and travels and, is on site talking to people and very visual in your writing and in your reporting. So what have you, what's the last 14 months been like for you professionally, and how have you tried to navigate that?
Yeah, it's been strange. Certainly the sports world shut down. And so I went over to the national desk at the Times and worked for them for a few months, which was fun and got to do a lot of interesting stories. It's certainly, I'd much prefer being out and about. I did find a few stories I could do by car here in California for the national desk and for the climate desk. But other than that, I think the lesson is how much I love Zoom and doing video.
Really?
Yeah, even now I will try to get people to do a video call instead of a phone call.
Okay.
Something I've never done before. I just think it's different. I talking here face to face is a little bit different than somebody on a phone. So if nothing else, I'm glad that video calling has become part of the repertoire of reporting.
Yeah, it's funny, how little any of us really use Zoom, or Skype was a rare thing to use before all of this. And now it just feels much more not a big deal to send somebody a Zoom link or to figure out a way to do this. Do you find that people you're talking to are kind of more receptive to it and kind of more familiar and at ease with it?
Definitely. I think even my own parents could probably, do a Zoom call. And so
Right.
There's really no excuse for a lot of people not to do it unless they just would rather just do it on the phone, which is fine. But any of my sort of major interviews where I want to, really talk to somebody for more than just a couple of minutes, I've tried to do it by video. I just think it's better. And I think, my thing has always been, if you can get your sources to a coffee shop, get yourself into their homes. I think people are just different when they're face to face. And I think people maybe put their guard down a little bit and realize I'm just a normal person. When they see me face to face, I'm just a goofy dude, not just a voice of the New York Times on the phone. And so I think for all those reasons, it's a good thing.
So one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on this week is, as we record this, you have a book coming out next week, Sidecountry, an anthology of your pieces for the Times. And congratulations. That's pretty awesome. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Well, thank you.
What is this week? I saw on Instagram you got the unbooking, as all authors have to do now, the unboxing of the book. So what's, I know this isn't your first book, but what's this time like for you as a writer when the book is done, it's done, and now you're just kind of in that time before it comes out and people start buying it and reading it and reviewing it and talking about it? What's this like for you?
Yeah, two things. One is that it's just a huge honor. Like, you realize how cool this is, and I walk into bookstores still, and I look at all the books, thinking, who are you people that manage to get books published? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
hard. And so I don't ever want to lose sight of the fact that, any book I write may very well be the last one I write, because it's hard to get it done. And so I have total respect for people that can somehow make a living doing this. I'm glad to have a 9-to-5 job. The second thing is that it's really strange to promote a book, because in my world, we don't self-promote very well, and nor should we. But books are really based on promotion. And so the publishers really want the authors to sort of put themselves out there and do all you can to promote the book. And so you sort of feel like you're kind of shilling, and it's really uncomfortable. Kind of goes, I'd like to think it goes against my personality. Maybe people would say it's actually right on my alley because I'm a big self-promoter or something, but I don't think so. And so, yeah, it's a little odd, these kind of couple of weeks right before the book comes out, and then the first week or two after it comes out, when you're doing a lot of radio shows or you're trying to promote things on your Twitter accounts or whatever else. It's a little unnatural for a journalist, I think.
So you said something interesting here. You said, nor should we. And when you talk about journalists being self-promotions, why do you think that? Why don't you think we should be self-promoting?
Yeah, because I don't think we are the story. And I'm very comfortable being sort of the anonymous name at the top or wherever they want to put my name.
Okay.
I don't think we ought to be the story. And I think anything that detracts from the story we're trying to tell is probably not healthy for how the story is perceived.
And this is, you said you've written books before, but this is a little bit different because it's an anthology. So it's stories you've already written that have been published in the Times and are being collected. First of all, how did this come about? How did you kind of get to being anthologized?
Yeah, good question. My editor at Norton, Matt Weiland, he's the one who edited the first two books I wrote. And he came to me and said, what about an anthology? And I thought, it's like, the Baha Men or something having a greatest hits album, or Aha or something. It's a great honor to think that I would have enough pieces worthy of putting on into pages of a book. And I think he also was thinking, until you figure out what maybe your next book might be, if I have a next book, this is a nice placeholder, if nothing else. And so he came to me and asked. And I think he was originally, I think he liked the idea of a lot of my outdoor stories. I've sort of more and more written about the outdoors, and a lot of my bigger stories have been sort of outdoor adventure stories. And he liked that idea. And so as we started winnowing down the possible stories for this book, I realized that not all of them were my favorite stories. And so we sort of made a little concession that we would expand what, Sidecountry meant, what the boundaries of sports meant, and include some stories that aren't, really outdoor adventure stories, a little bit more personal to me, that mean something to me. So it's kind of a wide range of my favorite stories. I'm really proud of it.
How long did it take you? Like what was the process like of finding which stories fit this book? What was that like?
Yeah, so I did it all off top of my head, which was interesting. There's no real way to go through the New York Times archives and say, what are the best stories?
Right.
And so I said, I think I can do it by memory. And so I sat down and just with a piece of paper, thought, what are the stories that mean the most to me that I think would fit in this collection? And there were probably 40 of them, maybe. Okay. That came to me. Some that didn't come to me until I went into the archives and went, oh yeah, I forgot about that one. But I went through that list, and then I started looking them up and rereading them. And in some cases I thought, wow, I used to be really pretty good writer. Like, what happened to my skill? Because the story 8 years ago is way better than anything I've written since then. And in some cases I read stories and was really disappointed, because I thought, oh, the story in my head was much better than it is here on paper, or the memory of the story and the experience of reporting it was really special to me. And then I read the product, the story itself, and I think, oh, I've missed some opportunities here. I wish I would have done this differently. I suppose I've changed as a writer in the few years that have passed since some of these stories have been written, that maybe I would have done them differently now. And so I thought, oh, I guess that story's off the list, and just kind of kept winnowing that list down further and further, and finally sort of had a list, kind of said, do these all work together? Could we make a book out of this? And Matt fortunately said, yes, I think we have something here.
So what was it like for you to kind of revisit these stories? You mentioned that a little bit, but to kind of read through these again and to be back where you were 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, what's that like?
It is so weird, and you understand this. Reporters don't go back and reread stories.
Right.
Like the second the story is sent, I don't even read it in the paper. I don't go back online and read it. I'm one of those guys, like, I don't even want to look at it. It's done. I don't read it. And so you have no reason to go back. And I was thinking about this. Unlike, say, like somebody who writes music, they hope they write a story or they hope they write a song. And in the best possible way, if it succeeds, they will be singing that song again and again and again for the rest of their careers.
Right.
Reporters are the opposite. Like, I don't want to look at it again. When people have asked me to come talk about Snowfall, I've had to go back and look at it a little bit, just to refresh my memory to see how I wrote it. I have a horrible memory for the kinds of, or I have a horrible memory for the lines I've written. I said the past week, the only line of any of these stories I could have told you how it started. I mean, this is true. Of these 20 some stories, the only story I could say, I remember how this story started is Snowfall. And that starts with Avalanche, Elise. But none of the rest I could. And so it was strange to go back and read these just because I never have an opportunity to, or never need to. And so sometimes I go back and read them and I wince, and sometimes I am pleasantly surprised.
So you mentioned Snowfall, and obviously you won the Pulitzer for that. I was mentioning before we started here that I still teach that every year in my digital journalism class. For one thing, totally random question, but you win the Pulitzer for this. What's it like the day after or the week after, the first story after you win the Pulitzer? Like, you get the award, you celebrate, you have the champagne toast, but then when you sit down to write your next story after you're a Pulitzer winner, what's that like?
Wow. I don't really remember. It'd be fascinating to go back and look, see what my next story was after April, whatever that was. I don't really remember, but I do remember Joe Sexton, who was the sports editor back then, said to me, like, your life's going to change. And I don't know that it's changed, but I think the expectations people have of me have changed.
Okay.
And I do sometimes worry that people think that every story I write has to be some sort of epic story. I sometimes just want to write goofy little stories like I've always done. I love doing that kind of thing. So I think it's more of a case of how people saw me,
okay,
more than it's really changed me, but that's probably a cop out. I do sort of realize I have to live up to some sort of reputation that has been bestowed upon me by some gang of strangers who I've never met. It's all very strange.
So, and to kind of get to Snowball specifically, when you look back at that story, I mean, kind of what with, almost 10 years distance now since it came out, what kind of stands out to you when you look back at that story?
Two things. One is the collaboration of it. The thing I'm most proud about that story is just how many people at the Times had a piece in it. It started with an idea from Joe Sexton, the sports editor at the time, who came to me, and then I reported it. And then Joe Sexton and Jason Stallman, who became the sports editor, saw something in what I had started to write and pulled in people from the multimedia desks, the graphics desks, Steve Duenas among them, who's now a managing editor. And they said, well, there's something we can really sink our teeth into with some of the new technology for online storytelling. And so in the end, I think there were like 16 people that had a hand in it. And it's fantastic. And what I remember, again, more than the stories themselves, I remember the experience of writing them and reporting them. Mm-hmm. And so besides all the interviews I did with people, I do remember sitting in meeting rooms at the Times with people, watching them do these dazzling effects, and just thinking, I'm so lucky to work here. Again, I remember those kinds of things more than I remember, how did Section 4 start? I couldn't tell.
Right. And that's one of the reasons we talk about it in my digital journalism classes is the multimedia aspect of it. And sure, it's very interesting to kind of look at the multimedia aspect of it now, almost 10 years later, and to have my students look at it and be like, kind of remind them that this was new and crazy cutting edge. And not that it's not still, but it's very much
holds up very well.
It does. And so what was it like for you? I remember Snowfall being not just the great piece that you wrote, but it was like this, new wave of storytelling, multimedia elements and all of that. And there's a real interesting dialogue. I remember in in digital journalism Twitter, which is the nichiest of niche Twitters, I think, about that and about what it meant for journalism. So what was it like to be a part of that, but also like the writer of that? So like you've got the story, but then Snowfall kind of takes on this bit larger significance in journalism.
Yeah, it became a verb, right?
Right.
As people at the times have said, can you snowfall this story for us? It was strange because when people talk about it in those terms, I didn't have a very big part in that. I don't know how the technology works. I didn't create those things. I was nothing but sort of a consultant on all those graphics. John, does this work? Does this help you tell the story? It's still interesting because I still get emails and messages online from people who teach classes all around the world, or somebody who's doing a project for their college work in Brazil or in Spain or in England. Can we talk about Snowfall? And sometimes they want to ask me technical questions, which I'm like, I'm not the right guy. I get way too much credit for all that because my name was at the top. So it's interesting actually with this book, because this book has Snowfall in it with none of that. We're going to see if Snowfall holds up as a text. And I've joked around, my mom has probably seen Snowfall. I'm not sure she's read it. It'll be interesting to see, how many people actually read Snowfall? How many people read it, or how many people just scrolled right through it to look at all the cool pictures? This is going to be a test to see if it holds up as a text, I guess.
How long did it take you to report that story?
It was about this time of year, probably May through most of that summer. I also moved from New York to California that summer, so that summer was a little nuts. But I probably had the text of it done between May and then probably September, and then that fall's when they worked on most of the digital work of it. But it was 17,000 words. And the interesting kind of backstory to that too is that I mentioned that I moved that summer. I was doing a lot of the reporting of that story in May and June, and then I moved at the end of June. And I was nervous that my editors were thinking, what is John doing? He's been working on this thing for weeks. We've hardly heard from him. And so just out of self-preservation, I think just to kind of convince my editors that I'm actually working on this, is I dumped a file of interviews that I had cut and pasted into a huge timeline. Okay. Pages, dozens and dozens of pages of a Google Doc or whatever it was back then, of a chronological timeline of quotes, and said, just so you know, I have been working, moving truck's coming tomorrow. I'll see you in a week. But here's what I've got so far. And that's when they saw that file, when I think they realized they had something special, and they passed it on to the digital folks and said, yeah. So that's the first and probably last story I've actually let my editor see my notes. And I think there's a little bit of serendipity in it that they happen to pass it on, because otherwise I probably just would have written the story. It would have been done in August, and who knows by that time if there would have been interest or time to really sink their teeth into it. It got a little bit of luck.
So in your Twitter bio, you have one of the best sentences. I love this so much. I try to write stories you didn't know you wanted to read. I love that. I absolutely love that. What's that mean to you? Where did you kind of come up with that idea as your bio / mission statement, whatever, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, I don't know where the actual words came from, but it is sort of my habitat, I guess. I have a short attention span, and so I get bored with sort of mainstream sports generally, and mainstream sports writing, which I understand is the world I live in. But if I can do stories that people aren't going to gravitate to because they know the subject, I know if I write about Tiger Woods or about Tom Brady, there's going to be a big audience for that just because it's Tiger Woods and Tom Brady. My quest is, what if I wrote about Don Doan, a bowler in Michigan you've never heard of, who's not famous at all beyond the city limits of his own little town? Could I get you to read that? And that's kind of the dare I see in that. Can I attract readers who feel a connection to people that they didn't have any connection to before they started reading the story?
Is that something you've kind of always felt throughout your career, or did it kind of come to you through experience?
Yeah, I think I've been a little bit one of those that tends to run away from the pack. Part of it was my first job as a sports reporter. It was for the Colorado Springs Gazette. And I was working in Denver covering the Broncos and the Colorado Avalanche during their heyday. And there were two big papers there covering those teams. Adam Schefter was covering the Broncos when I was covering the Broncos. And I was not going to compete with those guys on trades and free agency, that kind of thing. They had all the connections in the world. They were the big papers. And so I went in there and thought, what can I do differently? And how can I make a mark for our coverage that isn't just an echo of the bigger papers? And so I fell pretty quickly into this habit of just trying to find something that nobody else was doing. And that sort of became my reputation. And I've been trying to ride that as long as I can.
So how do you like as you're looking for stories that are kind of away from the pack or kind of these types of stories, where do you how do you start finding them? Like, where are you looking to get them? How is your, like, and your antenna is always up, but where do you point it to find stuff?
Yeah, they come from all over the place. I don't spend a lot of time in locker rooms anymore, but back when I was an NFL beat writer, you just start talking to people who don't get talked to very much. There's certain personalities in locker rooms that all the cameras gather around. And as you're watching this horde around the quarterback, you look around and see who else is in there all by themselves going, let's just go chat with that person. Okay. And sometimes you can just get people to kind of tell you what's the real story going on here, or just in the passage of a conversation, an idea will pop up. More generally, I just find stories in things that I don't know a lot about. Okay. I think it's a little bit of a childlike curiosity. Most of my stories are on subjects I knew nothing about before I started reporting on them. And, there's a risk involved in that, certainly. But it's because I see something and kind of go, oh, how do they do that? Why do they do it that way? I've had stories that I've done that have come from my kids that will ask me, Dad, how do they do that? One was about the mowing patterns on baseball fields. Right. And, me being a dad, I tried to explain it and really quickly realized I had no idea what I was talking about. And so decided maybe there's a story there. So a lot of it's just kind of the hows and whys. And I feel a big responsibility to take readers behind the scenes and explain to them either how things are done or why they're done, or what it looks like and feels like in that locker room, at that stadium, at that event, in that person's living room. I feel like I'm the proxy. Like, I have a big responsibility. X number of readers have sent me in as a representative into the situation. And my job is to tell them exactly what it would be like if they were there. And that's what I do.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways, always thinking of my students, I was thinking of like young writers, and to kind of develop both that curiosity, which you like to think is natural to reporters, to a lot of reporters, but also I feel like there's a certain amount of courage that comes along with not writing the Tom Brady story or the LeBron story or something that, especially given, the industry and the economics of traffic of stories and stuff like that. So both, like, what's some advice? What would you tell a young reporter? How can they develop and build that curiosity and then kind of turn that curiosity into something beyond just like, oh, I wonder what that is. And then, kind of that next step.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, first of all, I'm really lucky. Look, I understand how lucky I am to work for a place that allows me to do that. Going back to Colorado Springs, they knew we can either just run the next day what Adam Schefter broke the day before in the Denver Post, or we can do something totally different and give our readers a different experience. And that sort of has carried on to places like the New York Times. So I'm lucky to work at a place and for people who value different stories. We're going to make our mark by doing something that our readers aren't going to get anywhere else, as opposed to we have to follow the pack. Now, I understand a lot of journalists are stuck in places where they need to, and sometimes they want to follow that pack. How to get your curiosity going, I think, is just don't be afraid to ask dumb questions. I've never been shy to admit to people that I'm writing about that I know nothing about what they do. I've never been shy about raising my hand in press conferences and asking the question that gets people to snicker. I think a lot of sports journalism is sort of a wink, wink, nod, nod. Let me show you how much I know, and try to impress either my peers or the coaches or something. And I'm a guy that's like, who cares? You're not your audience. Your audience is the reader who wishes they were in your seat, and ask the questions that they want to know. Don't try to impress the people in this room. Try to teach the people that you'll never meet.
That's always one of my favorite things. That was my favorite trick as a reporter, because it was genuine. But like in a baseball locker room, when talking to a pitcher, be like, this is probably the dumbest question you're going to get all day, but what do you mean by release point? What do you mean by da 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 da?
Absolutely.
And what's great is that I found that gave me great answers, because players love talking about that stuff, because this is what they do. Like a pitch, like to use the release point as an example, pitchers think about that more than anybody else in the world. And to be able to talk about that, I think they get really excited to talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, people love to tell you what they know,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's a value in having the humility to explain to them, you don't know what you're talking about, and I would like you to teach me.
Right. Right.
And Release Point's a great example. I remember when I was covering the NFL, everybody was talking about the cover two, and you'd have these questions at the press conference. Hey, coach, I saw on that big third down play, you guys were in the cover two, and I know so and so did this. And I'm like, really? This is going to be part of your story? This is fascinating. And the better question is, coach, what is a cover two? We always talk about it. I have no idea what we're talking about.
Right.
Can you explain that? Because nobody knows. We're just using a bunch of bullshit and just to try to impress people around us. And it just kind of drove me crazy. And so I'm not afraid to be the dumb guy. And certainly I'll ask questions that I know the answers to. They say that about lawyers. Don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to. But I'm certainly not afraid. And I think it's a valuable reporting tool to ask people, please explain something to me, even if it seems really simple.
Mm-hmm. And then, so that's kind of how you do a lot of the reporting. What's your writing process like, especially even for a longer story or just kind of a daily story? Like when you get your reporting done and you sit down to write, what's that look like?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what it is, certainly. If it's something that's a daily, which I don't do a lot of dailies anymore, as my editors will probably tell you, it's just cranking it out, open the file, and just bleeding it out and hoping that it makes sense.
Right.
We all, as sports writers, have written stories that we didn't actually read before we filed them because we just got to the end and filed it, and then was like, I hope that's okay. I'll read it while the editor's reading it. But most of my stories now are things I can take a little bit more time with, and more, I've started to write them out on a legal pad.
Really?
Yeah, I just think for my brain, I don't know if it's the speed of which I write is different than how I type, or if it's just kind of the informality of having a writing pad instead of this blank white screen staring at me. But I like the idea of just starting to scratch it out. So if you look at most of my recent stories, you would see a legal pad that has such and such lead, and then like I'll write nut, and I'll sort of scratch out just like a casual sentence that might hold up as kind of a nut graph. And then I need to know where I'm going after the nut graph.
Okay.
And I'll start to write out kind of where the next thing goes. And then I'm kind of like, okay, there's the format. There's kind of where the story's going. And then I might open up a file and start to see if it makes sense as I type it.
Gotcha. You're very Ernest Hemingway like that. I remember reading somewhere he would write out longhand and then type it, and then I think retype it. He had some sort of like 3-layer process, and the idea was you get each time you rewrite it, and so it kind of increases your chances at getting to the story. The more iterations you kind of do of it.
I really struggle to start a story until I have a lead, a sense of what a nut graph is, and then where it goes from there. And once I have that, then I feel like I can just sort of start to spit it out, and my brain will organize a story as I start to write beyond that point. Certainly I shift stuff around and everything, but those are the first 3 things. And if I don't have those 3 things, then I really struggle to get the story going.
I ask every guest I have on here, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately?
Best thing I've read lately. I've started writing or reading books, which I was never a huge book reader, which is kind of sad. I've always been a book reader, but the last year I've been reading a lot of books. So I just finished I'll tell you the last 3 books I've read. The Bear's Ears by David Roberts.
Okay.
David Roberts is a great mountaineer and mountaineering writer. Has written dozens of books about the Himalayas with some of the greatest climbers and climbs in history. But he also does about half of his genre is about the ancient civilizations of the Southwest. And so he's written a book about the Bear's Ears in Utah, which is a place he's been going to for decades to get lost, and all about the native populations there. So the Bear's Ears, I just read, because I've been writing more surfing and everybody keeps asking me, of course you've read Barbarian Days, right? So I just read Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. Maybe the best surfing book ever written. And I just read Susan Orlean's The Library book.
That's a great book. I read that last year. That was fantastic.
Yeah. So I think those are the last 3 as I'm looking around what's sitting around me.
Excellent. I can recommend, I had him on the podcast a few weeks ago, but Will Leach's new book, How Lucky. I'm about halfway through it, and it's just delightful. It's one of those books I'm taking my time with and not trying to fly through, because it's just so beautiful. It's very, if you've read Will, it's very, you can absolutely tell it's Will's voice and Will's work, and it's just delightful. So I can highly recommend that one.
Awesome. Well, it's on the list then.
Excellent. So I have to congratulate you on the summit story that you wrote recently for the Times too. I've climbed a mountain, and it's in the Adirondacks, so it's kind of, hiking mountain.
Did you get to the top?
I did. So and it was the actual top, which gets to the point. It was so fascinating because talk about stories you didn't know you would like or weren't interested in. I opened up that story because I was getting ready for this, and I read your stuff regularly, and it's not the story I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be the story is about how all the people who've climbed the 14 highest summits in the world maybe had not done it. And I thought it was going to be an environmental thing, like erosion or global warming has melted the summits away. But it turns out that they just maybe didn't get to the top. It was fascinating how that story kind of came out. Yeah,
thank you. And that's an example of a story that's kind of an obvious story when it came up, and the notion of like, what is a summit? And I said to my editor, I'm like, I think there's a story here. Like, what is a summit? Well, we think we know, right? And we all just assume when somebody says I got to the summit, who's there to question, well, did you really get to the summit, or did you stop before that last little outcropping? Did you climb up on that cornice, or did you stop a few meters short? And now there are people asking that question. And I think there's I hope it came through in the story. I think there's a philosophical or cosmic question there about, these goals that we set for ourselves. And I'm now sort of aware every time I go somewhere, like, did I really finish this? Did I really get to the end of the book? Did I really get to the top of the mountain?
So that was a fantastic story. I'll put a link to that in show notes, and there'll be a link to buy the book, which is out on June 1st. So it'll be out a week after this episode comes out. But John, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Brian, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.